To build a superpower, Japan had to commit the ultimate betrayal. It had to turn on its most legendary figures, its icons of honor and strength. It had to systematically, brutally, and completely destroy the samurai. This wasn't a slow decline. It was a calculated demolition. The story of modern Japan isn't just about innovation and growth. It's built on the ashes of its most famous warrior class. And the question is, why? Why would a nation destroy its own soul to survive? For over 250 years, Japan was a nation in a self-imposed prison. The Tokugawa shogunate had brought peace, but at the cost of isolation. The country was sealed off from the outside world. And inside this gilded cage, the samurai, once a fearsome warrior class, were changing. Peace is a slow poison for a warrior. With no wars to fight, they became administrators, bureaucrats, and court officials. They were a massive, expensive aristocracy, living on stipends paid in rice from the labor of peasants. They still wore their two swords, a symbol of their right to cut down any commoner who disrespected them. But for most, the swords were just that, symbols. Their fighting skills were fading, replaced by poetry and paperwork. They were a relic, a 7% minority ruling over the other 93%, and the system was becoming dangerously brittle. Then, in 1853, the cage was broken open. 4 black ships, smoke-belching monsters of steam and steel, sailed into Edo Bay. They weren't traders, they were warships. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy had arrived with a simple, non-negotiable demand: open Japan for trade or face the consequences. The Japanese military, with its swords, spears, and antique cannons, was utterly powerless against Perry's modern artillery. The Shogun had no choice. He signed the treaty, a humiliating agreement that favored the Americans. It was a national trauma. The shockwave of this event didn't just crack the foundations of the shogunate, it shattered the myth of samurai supremacy. How could the nation's protectors be so helpless? A fire of anger and nationalism was lit across the country. A new slogan began to echo through the domains: Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. For centuries, the emperor had been a powerless, divine figurehead in Kyoto, while the shogun held the real power in Edo. Now, discontented samurai, particularly from the powerful western domains of Satsuma and Choshu, rallied around the emperor. They saw the shogun's weakness as a betrayal of Japan itself. They believed the only way to save the nation was to overthrow the Tokugawa government, restore the emperor to power, and drive the foreigners out. This wasn't a unified movement. It was a chaotic mix of political maneuvering, philosophical debate, and outright terrorism. Samurai began assassinating foreign diplomats and shogunate officials, plunging the country into a decade of violence and instability. The irony was thick. The samurai who wanted to save Japan were tearing it apart from the inside. By 1868, the chaos erupted into a full-scale civil war, the Boshin War. It was samurai against samurai. On one side, the armies of the shogunate, fighting to preserve the old order. On the other, the imperial alliance, led by Satsuma and Choshu, fighting for a new future under the Emperor Meiji. But this was not a war of swords. The leaders of the imperial forces, men like Saigo Takamori of Satsuma and Okubo Tashimichi, were pragmatists. They had seen the power of Western technology firsthand. They armed their troops with modern Armstrong guns, Spencer repeating rifles, and Gatling guns. The shogunate tried to modernize as well, but the imperial side was more organized, more motivated, and had secured the legitimacy of the emperor's banner. The decisive Battle of Toba Fushimi, near Kyoto, was a slaughter. The shogun's forces, though larger, were routed by the superior firepower and tactics of the imperial army. The age of the sword was ending in a hail of bullets. With the shogun defeated, the 15-year-old emperor Meiji was restored to power. This is the moment known as the Meiji Restoration. But the emperor was still largely a symbol. The real power now rested with the men who had won the war, a small group of ambitious, brilliant, and ruthless oligarchs, mostly young samurai from Satsuma and Choshu. They had achieved their goal of overthrowing the Tokugawa. Now they faced an even bigger problem. They had inherited a fragmented, bankrupt, and technologically backward country. To expel the barbarians, they realized they first had to become them. They needed a modern, centralized state. They needed a modern economy. They needed a modern army. And standing in the way of all of it was the very system that had created them, the samurai class. Their first target was the very structure of feudal Japan. The country was divided into over 250 semi-independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo who had his own army of samurai. This was a nightmare for a central government. You can't build a unified nation on a patchwork of private fiefdoms. So, in 1871, the government made a radical move. They abolished the domains entirely. Just like that, centuries of feudal loyalty and local power were erased by decree. The daimyo were pensioned off and moved to Tokyo. Their castles turned into government offices. For the average samurai, this was a profound shock. Their loyalty, their identity, was tied to their daimyo and their domain. Now, their lord was gone, and their home was just a prefecture of a distant government. The ground was crumbling beneath their feet. The next blow was even more personal. It struck at the core of the samurai identity. For 1,000 years, fighting was the exclusive privilege of the samurai. They were the warrior class. But a modern nation doesn't need a warrior class. It needs a national army. In 1873, the government introduced universal conscription. Every male, regardless of social class, was now required to serve in the military for 3 years. A peasant farmer could be drafted, trained, and handed a modern rifle. Suddenly, the son of a man a samurai could have legally cut down in the street was now a soldier of the emperor, just as he was. This was an existential threat. It didn't just take away the samurai's job, it took away their purpose, their monopoly on violence, The very definition of their class was gone. They were no longer special. While their social status was being dismantled, their wallets were being emptied. Remember those rice stipends? They were a massive drain on the new government's finances, consuming nearly a third of the national budget. The oligarchs knew this was unsustainable. They began by cutting the stipends, then taxing them. The samurai, who had never had to work for a living, were suddenly getting poorer and poorer. Then, in 1876, the government delivered the final economic blow. They replaced the stipends with a one-time payment of government bonds. For high-ranking samurai, this was a sizable sum they could invest. But for the vast majority of lower-ranking samurai, it was a pittance. It was barely enough to survive for a few years. They were forced to find work, but they had no practical skills. They were trained for war and bureaucracy in a world that now demanded engineers, merchants, and factory workers. Many fell into destitution.
If the first 3 cuts were crippling, the 4th was the ultimate humiliation. It was a strike against their very soul. Also in 1876, the government issued the Haitore Edict, banning the wearing of swords in public. The daisho, the paired long and short swords, were more than weapons. They were the badge of samurai status, a physical manifestation of their honor and their right to rule. To be forced to give them up was to be stripped naked in public. It was the government telling them, in the clearest possible terms, you are no longer samurai. You are just another commoner. This act, more than any other, symbolized the death of the old ways. It pushed thousands of disenfranchised, impoverished, and humiliated samurai to the breaking point. Rebellion was now inevitable.
And the rebellion would find its reluctant leader in a man who was a national hero, Saigo Takamori. Saigo was one of the key figures who had overthrown the Shogun, a giant of a man from Satsuma. He was a brilliant military commander and a beloved figure known as the last true samurai. But Saigo grew deeply disillusioned with the new government he had helped create. He watched in horror as the traditions he cherished were cast aside. He argued fiercely against the rapid, wholesale westernization. After a bitter disagreement over a proposed invasion of Korea, he resigned from the government and returned home to Satsuma. There, he opened private schools that focused on traditional martial arts and samurai values. He became a magnet for thousands of angry, jobless samurai who saw him as their only hope. He didn't want a war, but he was becoming the symbol of resistance. The spark came in 1877. The central government, fearing Saigo's influence, tried to remove weapons from the Kagoshima arsenal in Satsuma. Saigo's students, enraged, seized the arsenal themselves. The line had been crossed. Pressured by his followers, Saigo agreed to lead them in a march on Tokyo to question the government. This was the start of the Satsuma Rebellion. It was the final, tragic showdown between the old Japan and the new. Saigo's army of around 30,000 traditionalist samurai, armed with a mix of rifles and swords, marched north. Against them, the government sent its new national army, the peasant conscripts. This was the ultimate test. Could an army of commoners defeat the legendary warriors of Satsuma. The government had railways to move troops, telegraphs for communication, and an industrial base to supply endless ammunition. Saigo had only the fighting spirit of his men.
The rebellion's momentum stalled at Kumamoto Castle. A small garrison of the imperial army, made up of former peasants and merchants, held out against Saigo's massive force for over 50 days. The samurai, masters of sword fighting, were cut down by rifle fire as they tried to scale the walls. The conscripts, fighting for their new nation, proved to be disciplined and courageous. They refused to break. This siege was a critical turning point. It drained Saigo's resources and gave the imperial government precious time to mobilize its full strength. The peasant army didn't just hold the line, they proved their worth. They proved that modern training and weaponry could defeat even the most fearsome samurai. The myth of samurai invincibility was shattered for good on the walls of Kumamoto.
After months of brutal fighting and being pushed back, Saigo and his last 400 samurai were cornered on a hill called Shidoyama, overlooking Kagoshima. They were surrounded by 30,000 imperial troops, and there was no escape. On the morning of September 24th, 1877, after a final night of drinking sake and singing songs, they made their last stand. The imperial army opened up with a massive artillery barrage. Then, Saigo and his men drew their swords and charged. It was a suicidal, magnificent, and heartbreaking final act of defiance. They charged into a wall of rifle and Gatling gun fire. Saigo was struck by a bullet in the hip. According to legend, one of his followers carried him to a quieter spot and, at his request, cut off his head to preserve his honor. With his death, the rebellion collapsed. The samurai as a military force were finished forever.
The government had won. The path to modernization was now clear. With the threat of internal rebellion gone, Japan accelerated its transformation at a dizzying pace. It built a world-class navy, industrialized its economy, and adopted a Western-style constitution. But what happened to the millions of other samurai who hadn't rebelled? Their story is complex. They were a class defined by privilege, but they were also the most educated segment of society. Many successfully transitioned. They used their education to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and government officials. The founders of Mitsubishi and other major corporations were former samurai. They traded their swords for briefcases and became the architects of the new Japan. But for many others, the transition was impossible. Unable to adapt, they slid into poverty, becoming a bitter and forgotten underclass. And here's the final crucial twist. Once the samurai class was safely destroyed as a political and military threat, the government did something remarkable. They resurrected its ghost. The Meiji state needed a powerful national ideology to unite the people, a code of conduct for its new army. So they created one, and they called it Bushido, the way of the warrior. They took the ideals of samurai loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice stripped them of their feudal context and repurposed them for service to the emperor and the state. The samurai spirit, once a threat, was now the fuel for Japanese nationalism and later militarism. Even Saigo Takamori, the rebel, was posthumously pardoned and hailed as a national hero, a true patriot. A statue of him was erected in Tokyo. The man who fought to stop the new Japan became a symbol of it.
So why did Japan have to destroy its samurai? The answer is as simple as it is brutal. They were incompatible with the modern world. A nation cannot be a global power when it's run by a hereditary warrior caste, fragmented into feudal domains, and crippled by an economic system that rewards birth over merit. The samurai were a beautiful, complex, and iconic part of Japan's past, but they were also a barrier to its future. Their destruction wasn't just a side effect of modernization, it was a prerequisite. The Meiji leaders, many of them samurai themselves, made a painful choice. They sacrificed a part of their nation's identity to ensure its survival and ultimately its astonishing rise. They killed the warrior to save the nation, and in doing so, created the Japan we know today. What do you think? Was this ruthless transformation justified? Let me know in the comments below.